I thought I'd come down here again like I have last week, not thinking we'd have as many of you show up on this morning with the weather like it was. And so, of course, I'm glad you're all here, and we're continuing in this series called The Morning of the Third Day. And so we'll be talking about another third day event this morning. This has been the 6th or 7th week. I've lost track now with the voice and the cold and all that kind of stuff. So I'll be in the narthex, at least I plan to be today after the service, but I'll just give you this like I did during the time of sharing today. Scott, if you can put the sermon title up, because the subtitle here is that Queen Esther, I call it Queen Esther and the Overcoming Church. Because for God's people, Esther, that we're going to be looking at today, really is a picture of the church. And I hope that you'll see that. But in order to see that, you need to know something of the story. And obviously, I can't share all of the book of Esther with you. Oh, I wish I could. It would be great, because there's so much there. But we're going to touch on parts of it that we need to touch on, I think, to help make it clear about what we're talking about today. On Wednesday and Thursday of this week, there's a celebration that all Jews throughout the world will be celebrating. Can anybody tell me what it is? Anybody know? It's not one of the major holidays. Purim. P-U-R-I-M. There it is. Did he have that up first? I didn't look to see if Scott put that up before you said that. It's not one of the best known of holidays. It's a holiday that is actually kind of a combination of our Halloween, New Year's Day, 4th of July, all kind of rolled into one. I guess we could even throw Thanksgiving in there, because there's things about our Thanksgiving that would fit with Purim. When we were in Israel last year, if you remember, Karen and I, about this time last year. And it was right before this holiday, Purim. And all the homes were decorated very much, I should say similar to, not exactly like, but similar to the way people decorate their homes before Halloween. And it was interesting. I didn't know a lot about Purim when we were doing this visit last year. Have learned more since. And of course, the book of Esther is where all this began, and where Purim came out of the book of Esther and what happened in their lives. But this Wednesday, and it starts at sundown on Wednesday, not till sundown, on Wednesday, Purim begins. And it continues then overnight and into the next day, and it ends on sundown on Thursday. Now, it changes depending on the year, like our holidays change. But this year, it's this week, Wednesday and Thursday. And Jews all over the world, even not so faithful Jews, will celebrate it, kind of like our folks celebrate 4th of July. You don't have to be a huge patriot. I'm not talking New England patriots, by the way. You don't have to be a huge patriot or lover of our country to celebrate the 4th of July. Everybody loves the 4th of July. Picnics, swimming, whatever goes on. So in the case of Purim, it's not just religious Jews. In fact, the book of Esther is the only book in the Bible that doesn't mention God. It's hard to imagine it's a book in the Bible that does not mention God. But it's there. And God is there. And God is doing his thing. But the name of God is not mentioned. And I could go... There's so many things I'd like to share with you, and it just isn't time. We can get into that. We can get into a lot of other things. But this holiday did evolve out of what happened in Esther and Mordecai's life. nearly 2,500 years ago, and it's still being celebrated. Purim. These were two Jewish cousins who lived in Persia. Persia, the Persian Empire, was the greatest, largest, most powerful empire. You've heard of the Roman Empire. Roman Empire, no, not bigger than the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire was the largest, greatest, strongest, most powerful empire in the ancient world. It took up, if you can imagine in size, it went from India. The Persian Empire went into India, the eastern part, or the west, it would be the western part of India, but the eastern border of the Persian Empire went all the way from India across all of the Middle East over to Libya in northern Africa and up into Greece, which is into Europe. So it took up parts of 3 continents, 2.9 million square miles, and had at that time in history a population they estimate to be around 50 million people, which doesn't sound like a lot of people today, but we're talking 2,500 years ago. 50 million people. It was 44% of the world's population was in the Persian Empire. Just want to give you those stats because of things I'm going to share coming up. This is where Esther and Mordecai lived. Their ancestors, probably great-great-grandparents or great-great-great-grandparents, were carried off into exile. Do you remember me? I've been talking about the northern kingdom of Israel and how it fell into sin and out of God's favor, and as a result, God allowed the Assyrians, those nasty people we talked about, descendants of today's ISIS, to come in, conquer the northern kingdom, drag the people off into exile, and they were scattered all over the place, and those were the 10 tribes of Israel, never to be heard from again. They melted into the population. That's it. Gone. 130 or so years later, in 586 BC, the southern kingdom falls. Jerusalem, same thing. They were on the verge at the time the other kingdom was messed up, but they hadn't gotten there quite yet. So they went through with their sin and their misery and their separation from God, and God allowed them to be conquered by the Babylonians. And so King Nebuchadnezzar and his troops come in and wipe out Jerusalem, carry off the things from the temple, carry the people into exile. Esther and Mordecai were descendants of those people that were carried off into exile. That's how they ended up in Persia. So they're in the city of Susa, which is on the border, it's in what would be today, present-day Iran, but on the real close to the border of present-day Iraq. And that's where they lived. That's a long way from Jerusalem. But that's where their families were carried off, and that's where they ended up settling. And a lot of people think that Mordecai and Esther were uncle and niece. It wasn't. They were cousins. Mordecai was older, considerably older. That's why I asked the kids if they had older cousins. Mordecai was considerably older. Esther's parents passed at an earlier age, and Mordecai raised her. And that's one reason why a lot of people thought it must have been an uncle and not 2 cousins. But anyhow, let me get back to the holiday. This holiday that's celebrated every year, the scroll of Esther, which would be our book of Esther, is read in the synagogue. So this Wednesday night, after sundown, people will go, Jews will go to the synagogue, religious or not, they'll go to the synagogue, and they'll hear the story of Esther read out loud. And then the next day, Thursday, during the day, they go back to the synagogue, and they'll hear the story read again. Or if they only go once, some will go twice. But the idea is that the story is called the Scroll of Esther, will be read at that time. 2,500 years ago, Xerxes, who was the king of Persia, the most powerful nation, empire in the world, disposes of his queen. And he puts a search out over the kingdom to find a new queen. Somebody young and beautiful and a virgin. And so of all the women in the kingdom, young girls in the kingdom, who are brought to Xerxes, Esther wins his heart. In fact, I'll just say now that based on what it says in the scriptures, whenever she shows up in front of him, his heart melts right there. She's obviously beautiful, but there's just something about her, I guess, in addition to her beauty, that just melts his heart. And so of all these women, Esther finds favor with the king. So, soon after he makes Esther the new queen, this guy by the name of Haman, a bad boy, works his way into power. He becomes the second in the hierarchy, right underneath the king. Kind of like Joseph was in Egypt under the Pharaoh. Whatever he says goes. If he walks by, people bow down to him, just like he was the king. What we have to remember here is that at this point in time, although Esther is the queen, and Mordecai, by the way, is in the picture, because there's a time here after Esther is the queen where Mordecai finds out there's people in the empire who want to assassinate King Xerxes. Let me say it. I have so many different ways of pronouncing it. None of them were right until I finally looked it up, and it's actually Xerxes. Mordecai lets Esther know that there's these guys that want to assassinate him. And of course, the king takes care of business, getting these guys out of the way. And there's this indebtedness to Mordecai as a result, because he's the one that got the word to Esther, and Esther gets the word to the king. But all along here, in this time frame, the king does not know that Esther is a Jew. And he doesn't know that this man that he's indebted to, Mordecai, is a Jew. So you need to know that at this point. He doesn't know that. And this is the man, this Haman has worked his way into this position of power, like I said, to whom everybody is supposed to bow. Everybody, unless your name is Mordecai. And Mordecai will not bow to Haman. And Haman doesn't appreciate it. In fact, he gets so angry with Haman, or with Mordecai, that he wants to do Mordecai in. But that in itself is not enough. He wants all Jews dead. Now, I am going to read a story from the 3rd chapter of Esther. And some of you who came in earlier, I passed out some noisemakers. And I thought it would be fun. It's okay to have fun, isn't it? I thought it would be fun to do what the Jews are going to do on Wednesday and Thursday. Because as the scroll of Esther is read, and the name of Mordecai is mentioned, every time his name is mentioned, the people cheer. Can you cheer? Okay, we'll find out. Every time the name of Haman is mentioned, people stomp their feet or boo or blow noisemakers. And so we're going to see how this goes. I'm going to read from the 3rd chapter of Esther. And those of you with the noisemakers, get them ready. If you've got feet, most of you do, get ready to stomp your feet or boo when you hear the name of Haman. So, and sometimes it's pretty rapid. I'm going to read slow, but some of their names come one after the other. So are you with me? Are we going to have fun? Okay, let's do it. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him, as I shared with you, and giving him a seat of honor higher than all of the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman. For the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials of the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore, they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated. For he had told them, he had told them that he was a Jew. Remember, the king still doesn't know this. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down and pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the Pur, see where the holiday Purim comes from? That is, the lot was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month, and the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. What this is the day that all the Jews will be destroyed, annihilated. Haman picked a day by lot. It was decided. I'm sorry, I threw that name out there. That's how it was determined that on this date, all the Jews in the entire kingdom would be killed. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them." And so, that's okay. That's a bad thing, isn't it? We can blow the horn on that one. And so, King Xerxes, not knowing that Esther, his queen, is a Jew, and Mordecai, the man he's indebted to, is a Jew, he goes ahead and he puts out the order that Haman wanted. Now, in the end, because I've got to skip over a lot of stuff, you got to read the book of Esther. You know what? It would be a good time to do it Wednesday and Thursday. Read some of the chapters on Wednesday and read some more on Thursday. Haman, in the end, Haman's plot is foiled. The king's order is rescinded. He puts people as couriers on horseback and sends them throughout his kingdom to get there, to get everywhere, and get the word out that order to destroy the Jews is not to be carried out. And in fact, he issues a new order, because it's at that time then that, and we're going to talk about that, where Esther approaches the king, tells him she's Jewish, Mordecai is Jewish, and he revokes the order and puts out a new order. And the new order is for all people who are enemies of the Jews, that they are to be destroyed instead. Pretty amazing. Starting with Haman. Wow, that was powerful. And his 10 sons impaled on stakes, and 75,000 other people throughout the kingdom, all who were considered enemies of the Jews. And so it is that through these two people, Esther and Mordecai, God moves to save his people. A move that required two people with exceptional faith. Would you say yes to that? Two people with exceptional faith who would not give in and who would not give up. They both obviously have a heart for God and a heart for their people. And they proved that they were willing to do whatever it would take to save their people. And though Esther, we think, well, what did Esther do? I mean, she just went to the king. Esther, because of Haman being so close to the king, she's got to step in between that relationship. Haman wanted the Jews dead. It was not legal for a person to go into the presence of the king without being invited. And Esther had not been in the presence of the king for 30 days. Kings had other women. The queen didn't have to be available every day. She hadn't been in the king's presence for 30 days. And when Mordecai told her she had to go to the king and tell him what was about to happen if there was any hope of saving their people. So she risked her life, because to go before the king without invitation is certain death. She goes before the king anyhow. She had asked for 3 days. She got word back to Mordecai. For 3 days, fast for me. Have the people, all the Jews, fast. So that when she goes to the king, hopefully, things will work out in their favor. But she didn't know that. So she goes before the king. And like I said, every time she went before the king, his heart just must have gone pitter-patter. And he extends his golden scepter to her, which is a sign that she's allowed to approach him. And she goes on then and tells him everything that Haman was going to do. And so the scriptures say this about that day. And this is from chapter 5. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm thinking these words should match up with what I have here. It begins with on the third day, Scott. There we go. Here's our third day. Esther did this. This is the day Esther approached the king. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes, and she stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. And when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her, and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the gold scepter. And then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request?" "Even up to half the kingdom." And Esther says, "If it pleases the king, let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." And from there on it goes, and the rest of the plot ends up being foiled. It all happened on the third day. When Esther approaches the king, the process was begun by which Esther would become the deliverer of her people. Now remember, this kingdom, I told you already how far it stretched. There were 127 provinces in that territory. 50 million people. Now I don't know if 500 years before Jesus was born, if any Jews had traveled beyond the width and breadth of this kingdom, this empire. But I imagine if many did, there weren't a whole lot. But it's possible at that time in history, and I don't know for sure, that there may not have been any Jews beyond the borders of this empire. And what would have happened if that order had been given by Haman and carried out? There would have been a Holocaust of the Jews. All of them would have been exterminated. Had two of God's faithful ones, Esther and Mordecai, not fulfilled their God-given work to do, their God-given purpose. Haman, when he had sent Esther this message that they needed to let the king know, said, Esther, you may have been, when she hesitated because she knew if she went before him, she could be killed on the spot without an invitation. He said, Esther, it's very possible that you have become queen for such a time as this. And with that said, she listened and did what Mordecai said she should do. Imagine if Haman's plans would have been carried out. Who among the Jews would have been left? Would there have been a young Jewish girl by the name of Mary who gave birth to a son named Jesus? On that third day, 500 years earlier than Christ was born, Esther, at the risk of her own life, not only goes to the king and does what has to be done to save her people, but in doing so, she actually puts her people in a favored position with the king. And not only puts them in a favored position with the king, but gives them a secure future, because now all their enemies are gone. So she saves her people, she puts them in a favored position with the king and throughout the whole kingdom, and they end up with a future that's secure. Now think about that for just a minute, because when I was talking earlier about this idea of Queen Esther and the overcoming church, this is what Esther is. She is a picture of the overcoming church. And this is what we should be seeing in the church today. And more specifically, what we should be seeing in the overcoming church. You see, just as Esther risked her life to foil this plot that was intended to destroy all of her people, and an entire race of people, so too should the church, the overcoming church, be willing to risk everything to bring the lost to faith. Anything. Not only was Haman's deception exposed for who he was and his evil intentions, but the tables were actually turned against him, and just the opposite of what he wanted is what actually ended up happening. The people he was so glad to condemn actually became the most privileged in the whole kingdom. And that's what an overcoming church will do. An overcoming church, first of all, should have the mission. Their mission, first and foremost, should always be to make disciples for Jesus Christ at whatever the cost is, at whatever the sacrifice might be. It begins by exposing sin for what it is. It begins by exposing evil for what it is, and helping folks to know that they no longer need to live under the condemnation that sin brings, but that through repentance and the forgiveness of God, they can begin a new life and have a most favored position with their King, our God and King. And in that new life also receive the promise and the benefit of a secure future. You see, Esther is a picture, just a picture of the church today, or at least of what the church should be. It should be a church willing to sacrifice and be used in God's plan of salvation to save the lost, to save the condemned. And we do that. That's our goal, because we want everybody to know, because we're all sinners. We've all fallen short of the glory of God. We want them to know what Paul teaches us in Romans, that there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And so we let people know that God loves them. We let them know that they can be in a favored position with God rather than be separated from God. And we can let them know that their future is secure, and that one day, all of us together, every Christian, every believer, will stand before the Lord one day and sing his praises. And at that time, we'll be in glory. We'll have not only our favored position in this life, but we'll know that our eternity is secure, because we'll be there. We'll be there with the Lord. We're going to stand and sing right now, One Day, because I want you to get that feeling that just as the Jews celebrate, what they do with this holiday is they're celebrating what happened? They're celebrating the fact that they weren't destroyed, they weren't annihilated, they weren't exterminated, but that they were saved once and for all. And for us, it means an awful lot, because that covenant that began with Abraham and needs to go all the way to Jesus may have been stopped right then and there had it not been for the faithful ones, two people, Esther and Mordecai. And because of them, and because of what Jesus has done for us, we'll stand one day in his presence, and we'll sing of his glory. We'll sing his praises. Anybody in the praise team wants to come up? They can come up and help out with this song. But we're going to sing one day. Let's stand together.